Sir Keir Starmer came into power promising change.
Change. A total pack of lies.
He should resign and find out.
The British monarchy is on the brink of its greatest crisis in generations. Just moments ago, explosive revelations emerged from Buckingham Palace that have sent shockwaves through every corner of the United Kingdom. Prime Minister Keir Starmer stands accused of orchestrating a calculated confrontation with King Charles himself, a clash so severe that constitutional experts are calling it unprecedented in modern British history. The streets of London are erupting, Parliament is in chaos, and the very foundation of Britain's centuries-old constitutional monarchy hangs in the balance. What you're about to discover will shake you to your core, because this isn't just political theatre. This is a battle for the soul of Britain, and the consequences of what happens next will reshape the nation forever. The crisis exploded into public view less than an hour ago when leaked documents from inside number 10 Downing Street revealed a secret strategy that has left the nation reeling. According to multiple sources close to the palace, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has been systematically undermining King Charles's constitutional authority for months, deliberately bypassing royal protocols and making critical decisions without the monarch's knowledge or consent. This isn't speculation or rumour. These are documented actions that directly challenge the delicate balance of power that has kept Britain stable for centuries. The leaked papers show a deliberate pattern of constitutional violations that legal experts are calling nothing short of a soft coup against the monarchy itself. The confrontation came to a head during what was supposed to be a routine weekly audience between the Prime Minister and the King. But according to palace insiders who spoke on condition of anonymity, the meeting descended into a heated exchange that lasted over 2 hours, far beyond the normal 30-minute protocol. Witnesses report raised voices echoing through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, something virtually unheard of in the carefully controlled environment of royal proceedings. King Charles, known for his measured approach and dedication to constitutional duty, reportedly demanded immediate explanations for decisions made without his consultation, decisions that affect the future of the Commonwealth and Britain's standing on the world stage. The timing of this crisis couldn't be worse for the United Kingdom. The nation is already grappling with severe economic pressures, international tensions, and deep political divisions that have fractured communities across the country. Now, with the Prime Minister and the King locked in what insiders are calling an irreconcilable dispute, the entire machinery of British government threatens to grind to a halt. Opposition leaders are calling for emergency sessions of Parliament. Constitutional lawyers are poring over centuries-old precedents, trying to find guidance for a situation that has no modern parallel. And the British people are left wondering how their government could have reached this breaking point without anyone seeing it coming. What makes this crisis particularly explosive is the nature of the disputed decisions themselves. Sources reveal that Starmer has been making commitments to foreign powers and international organisations without seeking the King's approval, a direct violation of constitutional convention. These aren't minor diplomatic pleasantries. We're talking about agreements that could fundamentally alter Britain's relationships with key allies and trading partners. The Prime Minister allegedly argued that in the modern era, these consultations are merely ceremonial and that the elected government has the authority to act independently. But King Charles, backed by constitutional experts and legal advisors, maintains that these protocols exist for vital reasons and that abandoning them threatens the entire constitutional framework that has served Britain for generations. The streets outside Buckingham Palace have transformed into a pressure cooker of tension and anxiety. Thousands of citizens have gathered, some waving Union Jacks in support of the monarchy, others holding signs demanding that elected officials, not hereditary rulers, should hold ultimate authority. Police have formed protective cordons as the crowds continue to swell, with more people arriving every minute. Social media has exploded with hashtags both defending and attacking the Prime Minister, with public opinion splitting along lines that don't follow traditional party loyalties. This isn't simply Labour versus Conservative anymore. This is a fundamental question about the nature of British governance itself, and families across the nation are finding themselves divided over which institution deserves their loyalty. Inside Parliament, the atmosphere is equally chaotic. Members of Parliament are demanding immediate statements from the Prime Minister, but Starmer has remained conspicuously silent since leaving Buckingham Palace. His cabinet is reportedly in emergency meetings trying to formulate a response to what many are calling the greatest constitutional crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936. Senior ministers are said to be deeply divided, with some backing the Prime Minister's assertive approach, while others fear that pushing too hard against the monarchy could trigger a backlash that destroys the Labour government and plunges Britain into political turmoil from which it might never recover. The historical weight of this moment cannot be overstated, and to truly understand the magnitude of what's unfolding, we need to examine the intricate web of constitutional conventions that Starmer has allegedly violated. The British Constitution, unlike those of most other nations, isn't written in a single document, but exists as a complex tapestry of laws, precedents, and unwritten conventions built up over more than 1,000 years. At its heart lies the principle that while the monarch reigns, the elected government rules. But this delicate balance requires constant consultation and mutual respect. What the leaked documents reveal is that Starmer has been systematically dismantling this balance, treating royal consultations not as constitutional necessities, but as inconvenient obstacles to his political agenda. Constitutional scholars are now warning that if these violations go unchallenged, the entire framework of British governance could collapse, leaving the nation without the stabilising mechanisms that have prevented the kind of political extremism and instability that has plagued other democracies. The specific incidents outlined in the leaked papers paint a disturbing picture of deliberate constitutional sabotage. In one particularly explosive revelation, Starmer allegedly committed Britain to a major international climate agreement without informing King Charles until after the deal was signed. This wasn't an oversight or administrative error. Multiple emails and internal memos show that advisors explicitly warned the Prime Minister that royal approval should be sought, but Starmer overruled them, arguing that seeking the King's consent would slow down the process and potentially give opponents time to mobilise against the agreement. In another incident, the Prime Minister is accused of making promises to European Union officials regarding future trade relationships without the constitutionally required consultation with the monarch. These aren't trivial procedural violations. These are fundamental breaches of the constitutional order that has governed Britain for centuries, and each one represents a deliberate choice by Starmer to prioritise his political objectives over constitutional propriety. What makes this crisis even more complex is the personal dimension between these two men. King Charles has spent his entire life preparing for the role he now holds, and his dedication to constitutional duty is well documented. He understands that his power is ceremonial and that he must remain politically neutral, but he also knows that his constitutional rights include the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. Starmer, on the other hand, came to power with a mandate for change and a determination to modernise Britain's institutions. Friends and allies describe him as someone who sees the traditional royal protocols as outdated relics that hinder effective governance in the 21st century. This fundamental philosophical difference has been building tension since Starmer took office, and sources say that previous meetings between the two men have been increasingly strained, with carefully worded disagreements gradually escalating into more direct confrontations. What happened today was simply the breaking point of a relationship that has been deteriorating for months. The implications of this clash extend far beyond the personal relationship between a Prime Minister and a King. If Starmer succeeds in establishing that royal consultations are optional rather than mandatory, it fundamentally rewrites the British Constitution. Future Prime Ministers would be able to act with virtually unchecked power, limited only by Parliament and the courts, with the monarchy reduced to nothing more than a symbolic figurehead with no meaningful role in governance. Supporters of Starmer argue that this is exactly how modern democracy should function, that the people elect the government and the government should be free to implement its mandate without interference from unelected hereditary rulers. But opponents warn that removing the monarchy's constitutional role eliminates a crucial check on executive power, a moderating influence that has prevented British governments from sliding into to authoritarianism even in the darkest moments of the nation's history. The monarch's power may be ceremonial, but its very existence forces prime ministers to pause, to consult, and to consider perspectives beyond their immediate political interests. The reaction from the Commonwealth nations has added another layer of complexity to this crisis. King Charles is not only the British monarch, but also serves as head of state for 14 other countries, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Officials from these nations are watching the crisis unfold, I thought, with deep concern, because if the British government can ignore constitutional conventions regarding the monarchy, what does that mean for Commonwealth nations where the king plays similar constitutional roles? Australian Republican movements are already using the crisis to argue for severing ties with the monarchy, while Canadian officials are privately expressing alarm at what they see as a British domestic dispute that could have catastrophic consequences for the entire Commonwealth structure. The crisis that began in Buckingham Palace this morning is rapidly becoming an international incident with ramifications that stretch across the globe. The economic ramifications of this constitutional crisis are already manifesting in devastating ways that will affect every British citizen. Within hours of the news breaking, the pound sterling plummeted to its lowest value against the dollar in over a year as international investors fled what they now perceive as dangerous political instability in one of the world's traditionally most stable democracies. The FTSE stock market saw billions wiped off share values as uncertainty gripped the financial markets, with analysts warning that prolonged constitutional chaos could trigger a recession that would make the economic troubles of recent years seem mild by comparison. Major corporations with headquarters in London are reportedly convening emergency board meetings to discuss contingency plans, including potential relocations to more stable European capitals. This isn't just abstract financial movement on computer screens. This translates directly into pension funds losing value, investment in British businesses drying up, and the very real possibility of job losses and economic hardship for ordinary families who had nothing to do with creating this crisis but will bear its consequences nonetheless. The political fallout is spreading through Parliament like wildfire, consuming everything in its path and creating strange alliances that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Conservative opposition leaders, who would normally seize any opportunity to attack a Labour Prime Minister, find themselves in the awkward position of having to defend constitutional traditions while simultaneously trying to exploit the crisis for political gain. Some Conservative MPs are publicly supporting King Charles and demanding Starmer's immediate resignation, calling him unfit to hold office if he cannot respect the basic constitutional framework of the nation. But other Conservatives, particularly younger members who have long advocated for modernising British institutions, are quietly sympathetic to Starmer's position, even if they cannot say so publicly without facing backlash from their traditional base. Meanwhile, the Labour Party itself is fracturing along fault lines that reveal deep ideological divisions. Traditional Labour members who value British institutions and gradualist reform are horrified at what they see as Starmer's reckless adventurism, while the more radical wing of the party is celebrating what they view as a long overdue challenge to archaic monarchical privilege. The Speaker of the House has announced an emergency debate for tomorrow, but few believe that parliamentary procedures can resolve a crisis that strikes at the very heart of how Britain governs itself. The public reaction has been equally divided and increasingly volatile, with demonstrations spreading from London to cities across the entire United Kingdom. In Edinburgh, pro-monarchy protesters clashed with Republican activists outside the Scottish Parliament, resulting in several arrests and raising fears that this constitutional crisis could reignite Scottish independence movements that had quieted in recent years. In Cardiff, Welsh nationalists are using the crisis to argue that Wales should chart its own constitutional course, free from what they call the dysfunctional English establishment. Northern Ireland, always a powder keg of constitutional sensitivities, is seeing renewed tensions as different communities interpret the crisis through their own historical lenses of British versus Irish identity. What began as a dispute between a Prime Minister and a King in London is now threatening to unravel the entire United Kingdom, exposing fractures in the union that many thought had been healed, or at least contained. The crisis is revealing that Britain is far more fragmented and far less certain of its own identity than most people realised. Inside Buckingham Palace, King Charles and his advisors are facing impossible choices with no good options. If the King backs down and accepts Starmer's assertion of unlimited executive authority, he effectively renders the monarchy meaningless and sets a precedent that will haunt the institution for generations. Future monarchs would have no constitutional role beyond waving from balconies and attending ceremonial functions, with no meaningful input into the governance of the realm. But if King Charles pushes back too hard and insists on his constitutional prerogatives, he risks triggering a genuine constitutional crisis that could end with Parliament voting to abolish or severely curtail the monarchy altogether. There are whispers from palace sources that the King is considering an unprecedented public statement, something that would violate the traditional royal silence on political matters, but which Charles may feel is necessary to defend the constitutional order. Such a statement would be extraordinarily risky, potentially casting the King as a political actor rather than a neutral constitutional guardian. But the alternative of remaining silent while the constitutional framework crumbles around him may be even more dangerous. The international community is watching with a mixture of fascination and alarm. One of the world's oldest continuous democracies tears itself apart over questions that most nations resolved long ago through written constitutions and clear legal frameworks. American constitutional experts are being interviewed on news networks, explaining to baffled audiences how Britain has managed to function for centuries without a written constitution and why that system is now proving so vulnerable to determined political actors willing to ignore unwritten conventions. European leaders are publicly expressing confidence in British stability, while privately discussing what a complete constitutional collapse in the United Kingdom would mean for the European security, NATO cooperation, and the delicate balance of power in a world already dealing with wars, economic instability, and rising authoritarianism. The crisis is a stark reminder that even the most seemingly permanent institutions can prove fragile when the people responsible for maintaining them decide that their political objectives are more important than constitutional continuity. The historical parallels to this moment are both instructive and terrifying for anyone who understands British constitutional history. The last time a British Prime Minister so openly challenged the monarch's constitutional authority was during the tumultuous reign of King Edward VIII. But even that crisis was resolved through abdication rather than direct confrontation between the Crown and the government. What we're witnessing now has echoes of the 17th century conflicts between King and Parliament that ultimately led to civil war, regicide, and decades of bloodshed before a stable constitutional settlement was reached. Modern Britain likes to think of itself as having evolved beyond such primitive struggles for power, but the current crisis reveals that the fundamental tensions between democratic legitimacy and traditional authority have never truly been resolved, merely papered over with conventions and gentlemen's agreements that only work when both sides are willing to honour them. Starmer's apparent decision to abandon these conventions has ripped away the facade and exposed the fragility of a constitutional system that depends entirely on good faith and mutual restraint rather than enforceable legal rules. The media landscape has erupted into a feeding frenzy unlike anything seen in British journalism since the darkest days of Brexit, with every news outlet scrambling to break new details and offering increasingly apocalyptic analysis of what this crisis means for the nation's future. The BBC, traditionally restrained and careful to maintain neutrality, is struggling to cover a story that inherently challenges its obligation to respect both the elected government and the constitutional monarchy. Editors are holding emergency meetings to establish guidelines for how to report on a conflict where both sides can claim legitimate authority. and early coverage has already drawn fierce criticism from both pro-monarchy and pro-government factions who accuse the broadcaster of bias. Tabloid newspapers have no such restraints and are running with sensational headlines that inflame rather than inform, with some papers depicting Starmer as a dangerous radical intent on destroying British traditions, while others portray King Charles as an out-of-touch aristocrat, clinging to medieval privileges. Social media has become a battlefield where facts and misinformation blend together indistinguishably, with viral videos, doctored images, and conspiracy theories spreading faster than any attempt at fact-checking can contain them. The information environment itself has become part of the crisis, making it nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to understand what's actually happening versus what various partisan actors want them to believe is happening. Behind closed doors, frantic negotiations are reportedly underway to find some kind of face-saving compromise that could de-escalate the crisis before it spirals completely out of control. Senior civil servants who pride themselves on maintaining governmental continuity regardless of which party holds power are working desperately to broker some kind of understanding between Number 10 and Buckingham Palace. These are the people who truly keep Britain functioning, the permanent bureaucracy that survives changes of government and understands better than anyone how close the nation is to genuine constitutional collapse. Sources suggest they are proposing various formulas that would allow both sides to claim victory while backing away from the brink, perhaps involving Starmer issuing a clarification of his respect for constitutional conventions, while the palace agrees not to press the matter further. But both principals in this drama have strong incentives to stand firm. Starmer knows that backing down would be seen as weakness and would embolden his opponents both within his own party and in the opposition. King Charles understands that accepting this violation of constitutional norms would set a precedent that fundamentally transforms the monarchy's role and potentially makes the institution irrelevant. The civil servants may be brilliant at finding bureaucratic solutions, but this is ultimately a political crisis that requires political resolution, and neither side seems willing to blink first. The implications for Britain's international standing are becoming clearer with each passing hour, and they are uniformly grim. The United Kingdom has long prided itself on being a stable, predictable partner in international affairs, a nation whose word could be trusted, and whose political system, I assume, however quirky, delivered consistent governance. That reputation is now in tatters. Foreign ministries around the world are issuing internal assessments, questioning whether agreements made with the current British government will be honoured by future administrations, or whether the constitutional chaos will lead to political instability that makes Britain an unreliable partner. Trade negotiations that were proceeding smoothly have suddenly hit obstacles as partners demand additional guarantees and assurances to protect themselves against British political uncertainty. Intelligence sharing arrangements are being reviewed as allied nations question whether a government in constitutional crisis can be trusted with sensitive information. Britain's enemies and rivals are celebrating what they see as the self-inflicted collapse of a major Western democracy, using the crisis as evidence that liberal democratic systems are inherently unstable and inferior to more authoritarian models. The damage to British soft power and international influence may take decades to repair, long after this immediate crisis is resolved one way or another.